Last weekend here at St. George's, we did something a little different, something that we haven't done before. We offered what we were calling the Saints and Sinners Ghost Tour. Now, these weren't so much spooky stories as haunting stories. We took this deep dive back to 2.5 centuries to the people and the stories who literally built this church, built these walls, built this city of St. Catherine's, had a really strong hand in even how our country was formed and created. And these were stories of suffering, of loss, of fear and uncertainty, people who fought in the American Revolution, people who fought on the losing side of that war, people who lost their homes and livelihoods because they were on the losing side of that war, people who found themselves in this area in unknown territory, having to create a new life, people who fought again in the War of 1812. And yet I was struck over the course of our evening of storytelling how much our lives are connected to what they did all of those years ago, and also how much those many years separating our stories from theirs flatten out, smooth over all of the rough edges of those stories, so that so easily all that we're left with is kind of interesting histories from long ago history books that we can pull out and dust off, marvel at, and then put away again. And as I was reflecting on the nature of that storytelling, I also got thinking about today, Remembrance Sunday. I got thinking about November 11th, just around the corner, Remembrance Day. And I felt with all of my heart, we can't let that happen to these stories. We can't let that happen to these acts of remembrance. We can't let those stories of sacrifice become just interesting, flattened down stories that we pull out once a year, marvel at, and then put away again. Now, by no means am I the first to identify a time of transition that we're in right now. A couple of decades ago, when we would have gathered as a community of faith on Remembrance Sunday, there would have still been World War I veterans among us. And up to a couple of years ago, there were still World War II veterans among us. And every unfolding year, we get further and further away from that first-hand experience of just what catastrophic tragedy and violence and loss we are talking about in World War I and World War II. What it was like to have all of those young people, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions across the world, so many of them not much more than children and young boys, just wiped out in the course of a couple of years. How many families were shattered by these losses? How many people who fought and lived had to come back and figure out how to pick up the pieces of their lives? And how all of the rule books were rewritten about what kind of destruction humanity is capable of unleashing on itself. I've heard more than one commentator, especially over the past year, wonder whether there is a connection between those unfolding years, separating our stories from theirs, and the fraying of a world order that was put in place following World War II that was supposed to guard against this kind of global catastrophe happening again. Whether there is a connection between that loss of firsthand experience and a more cavalier attitude toward war and peace. We cannot afford to let these stories of sacrifice and loss be smoothed over and dusted over with the distance of time, to be relegated to the history books and dusted off once a year. Our Christian faith is founded, among many things, on the premise of living remembrance. When Jesus gathers with his friends around a supper table on his last night, and he tells people, when you do this, remember me, he's not calling his followers to become history buffs. He is talking about remembrance as a bodily thing, as something that remembers us, that calls us back to the stories that live in our bodies and live in the body of this community. That Jesus continues to call us to God's supper table. That Jesus continues to promise to be with us. That Jesus continues to reach across the chasms of all of the destruction and the violence and the heartbreak and the grief and loss and suffering of our lives. And that when Jesus says to Mary and Martha at the tomb of their brother Lazarus in the gospel passage that we just heard today, when he says to them, I am resurrection and I am life, this is not a one and done promise for a couple of people. This is about the promise that God is not going to let our lives stay lost, forsaken. That what is dead is not going to stay dead. That God is always going to be drawing us back and raising us up into the fullness and healing of the life and the relationship for which we are created. Relationship with God and relationship with one another. And wise people have said to me over the years that this sanctuary is a thin space where it is just a little easier to access those realities and that truth of God's living presence among us, of Jesus who walks with us, of the people who went before us. And their offerings are still part of us. Their voices still echo with ours when we raise our voices in prayer and praise. And their sacrifice and generosity and love is quite literally soaked into the walls of this building. Every year at this time, we offer a significant musical work, a requiem, a musical remembrance. I will say that in my 11 and a half years here at St. George's, the Dan Forrest Requiem that we offer this year impacts me more powerfully than any other musical offering we have done. And that is saying a lot, because we have a very high bar of musical excellence and beauty. Dan Forrest calls this a requiem for the living. And he says that this work is a prayer for rest for the living as much as for the deceased. It's a grant us rest even more than a grant them rest, tying our stories to the stories of those who went before us. In the next movement that we'll be singing during the Eucharistic prayer, the Sanctus, he translates the Latin words into English. Heaven and earth are full of thy glory. And he says this is not merely a worship moment, but a part of the divine answer to the problem of pain. This is how God speaks to our human suffering. I actually suspect that those words are the entire thesis for what Dan Forrest is offering in this composition. That what he's trying to do here is to embody that truth of how our physical human lives are not separate from God's life. That our human physical lives are actually infused with God's life, with God's loving presence, with the whole realm of heaven, and infused with the people who we have loved and who have gone before us. Dan Forrest wasn't specifically writing this piece, as far as I'm aware of, for Remembrance Day. But I do also hear in those words a response to that need for our remembrance to be a living, breathing thing. For us to recognize just how deeply our lives are infused with the lives of sacrifice that we honor and remember today. That we are who we are. We have this country that we have. We enjoy this peace that we enjoy because of who they were and what they did and what they offered. And in a moment, we are going to read a list of names. It is a long list of all of those who died in armed combat, in war, for this country in the past 111 years. We can't let those names wash over us. We can't let their stories become dusty stories from a time long ago. We have to remember in our bodies, in the body of this community, how their stories live in us, live in these walls, live in this church, live in this community, live in this country. We must remember them. And the mantle of responsibility for the peace for which they fought, it falls to us.